Hi, it's Mrs. Sonia, the art teacher from the Euclid campus, and this video is about painting with watercolor. I will share some tips and techniques for using watercolor to create your hybrid animal. Before we begin, let's go over the materials you need to have to get started. Watercolor paint, your cup of water, a paintbrush, a napkin, and a paper. Let's also review how to activate your paint and how to keep your paint clean. To activate your watercolor set, you need to start with a very wet paintbrush. Next, dip it in the paint that you're going to use and create lots of tiny circles until the paint turns from dry paint to wet paint. Then when you start painting, your watercolor should just glide over your page smoothly. If it's too dry, then you need more water. When it's time to get a new color, it's important that you clean your brush by dipping it in your water. Then activate your new paint and make sure you turn it from dry to wet before painting. Watercolors are great for blending colors. Now let's get started with 3 important tips. Tip number 1, sketch your animal lightly. When you draw your animal, be sure to sketch lightly with your pencil. Your lines will be easier to erase and your paint will show up brighter. Tip number 2, pay attention to how much water you use. Using a little bit of water will give you a darker paint, but it will be harder to spread because it's drier. Using a lot of water will be easier to spread, but it will be lighter in color. Tip number 3, be sure to wait for your paint to dry before adding layers or details. To add texture to your animal, such as fur or hair or scales, be sure to let your paint dry and then add those details. Here are some watercolor techniques you may be interested in trying. Wet on wet. This technique is good to use to cover large areas. First, cover an area with water. Then add your watercolor and blend and mix. You can also add different colors. Dry on dry. This is great for adding texture and details on top of dried paint. Your paint will still be a little wet, but you're trying to use a dried paintbrush on top of dried paint. There are so many different types of textures you can draw. Here are some scales that I'm adding. Salt. This is a fun way of adding some spotted texture. Make sure that your paint is wet and then take some salt and sprinkle it on top of your paint. The hardest part will be waiting for your paint to dry, but make sure your paint is completely dried before you brush off the salt. Lifting color. If you add too much paint or you want a lighter color, you can use a little towel or a tissue to lift the color. Crayon Resist. This is another fun way to add texture. Start by taking a crayon and draw your lines. Next, take some watercolor and paint over it. Because water and the wax from the crayon do not mix, the crayon will show brightly. And the last technique is a splatter technique. This is fun, but if you're going to use this, save it for the very end. You create a splatter by taking some paint and then using your finger, and then bounce your paintbrush on top of your finger so that the paint comes off into drops. Notice how the splattered paint spreads out when it lands on wet paint. So if you don't want it to spread, make sure your paint is dry before you splatter it. For more ideas and inspiration, you can always do a Google search of watercolor animals. I did, and here are some things that I found. Notice how the artist used light and dark colors to make the pig look three-dimensional. And look at the hair on top of its head. Notice how this artist used different rainbow colors. Remember, you are the artist and you can always use the colors that you want. Notice how this artist uses dark paint and very light paint and lots of colors in between. Notice how this artist creates texture of hair and fur and even eyelashes and whiskers. Remember that when you're making art, it's important to trust yourself. Go with the colors and textures that you feel are best.